Trump told Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to sit down, girl, during a live hearing, the room froze. Then she gave a response so sharp and composed, it left even his closest allies speechless. The camera was rolling, bright lights hummed overhead. The House Oversight Committee hearing on federal transparency had been dragging on for over 5 hours, but the air inside the room still felt charged. Reporters hunched over their phones. Aides whispered. Everyone knew the moment was coming. Donald J. Trump sat at the center table, unbothered as ever, thumbing through a few sheets of paper like he hadn't a care in the world. Dressed in his usual navy suit and red tie, he looked like someone who wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a black congresswoman from South Dallas with no time for games. Representative Jasmine Crockett, sharp in a cobalt blazer and black glasses, adjusted her mic and spoke directly, calmly, eyes never leaving Trump. Mr. Trump, she began, flipping a page, can you clarify why, in your 2019 and 2020 disclosures, there were such significant gaps in the valuation of your overseas assets? Trump glanced up, leaned back in his chair, and smirked. He was waiting for a moment like this. I've been more transparent than anyone here, he replied, brushing her question aside. And frankly, your tone is disrespectful. Crockett didn't flinch. Respect isn't a tone, Mr. Trump. It's earned. A few murmurs scattered through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Even C-SPAN's live stream chat started ticking faster. Trump waved his hand dismissively, like he was flicking a fly off a table. Then, with the confidence of someone who'd lived a life with little consequence for what came out of his mouth, he looked directly at her and said, "Sit down, girl." It landed with a thud. The room didn't gasp. It froze. The chairman lowered his gavel slowly, unsure if he was about to call for order or just absorb what had just happened. Some aides stopped typing mid-word. A few Republican representatives looked down. Others raised their eyebrows, but no one said a word. Crockett didn't react right away. She blinked once, then twice. She let the moment sit. It was like watching someone step carefully through broken glass, each second more intense than the last. She adjusted her mic again, leaned forward, and looked at him not with anger, but with clarity. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice smooth, even, deliberate. You may have spoken to a lot of women like that in your life, but I'm not here to serve you. I'm here to serve the truth. So if my questions make you uncomfortable, maybe that says more about your answers than my tone. The silence in the room thickened. Then a single staffer, seated behind her, whispered, "Damn." Crockett continued, unfazed. And one more thing. Your inability to address facts without resorting to dismissive language isn't strength. It's avoidance. And you're not avoiding me today. For a moment, Trump didn't say anything. He tapped a pen against the table, his mouth slightly open, searching for a comeback that didn't come. The chairman finally spoke. Mr. Trump, please respond to the question. But the moment had already stolen the show. It wasn't about tax records anymore, or overseas accounts. It was about power, and who was still allowed to wield it without consequence. Inside the media booth, CNN and MSNBC producers scrambled. Clip that, one said. That's going everywhere. Online, it didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, the exchange had been clipped, shared, captioned, and reposted. Twitter, Facebook, even TikTok. The phrase "sit down, girl" trended globally within the hour, but not for the reason Trump might have imagined. And somewhere in Fort Worth, an elderly woman paused her ironing to rewatch the clip again, eyes wide, shaking her head. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That girl just told him." But Crockett's words weren't just a comeback. They touched something deeper, and that's when things started to shift. You could feel it, that quiet tension after something crosses a line and nobody quite knows what to say next. The hearing room had seen plenty of heated exchanges over the years, shouting matches, walkouts, even tears, but this wasn't any of that. This was different. The silence wasn't about shock, it was about recognition. Everyone in that room knew what had just happened. They just didn't know what to do with it. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fist on the desk. She didn't even lean back in her chair when she was finished. She just sat there, composed, flipping to her next page like Trump hadn't just tried to diminish her with one phrase that carried the weight of something old, something tired, something deeply familiar to women who look like her. Representative Monica Rayburn, sitting 2 seats down, broke the stillness. She glanced at Crockett, then slowly exhaled. She wasn't just reacting to the words. She was reacting to the posture, the calm. Textbook, she whispered under her breath. That's how you handle it. Across the aisle, Representative Neil Camden scribbled something into his notebook and whispered to his assistant. She just turned the room upside down. Trump's face, on the other hand, had changed. His smirk had faded. The swagger in his voice was nowhere to be found. He looked, not shaken, but annoyed. Confused, maybe. Like someone had taken a swing at him in a language he didn't understand. Still, he tried to regain footing. I'm just saying, he muttered, loud enough to be picked up by the mic, that there's a way to talk to people. But no one answered him, not right away. It was like the spell had shifted from everyone watching her to everyone watching him. And that, perhaps, was what shook him most. The chairman tapped his gavel, not to scold, but to move forward. Let's proceed, he said. Representative Crockett, you have the floor. And she did, in more ways than one. Crockett resumed her questions with the same tone. She never referred to what had just happened. She didn't need to. The moment had done its job. Now it would carry itself. Outside the Capitol, the news vans had already started adjusting their banners. Trump tells Rep. Crockett, sit down girl, during heated exchange. Inside cable newsrooms, producers were barking into headsets. Cut from the budget segment, go with Crockett, get the full clip. And in living rooms across the country, people were rewinding, rewatching, sharing it with their spouses, texting it to coworkers. At a bar in Columbus, Ohio, two teachers on their lunch break sat in stunned silence, watching it play out on a muted TV. One of them, Janice, mouthed the words, "Did he really just say that?" Her friend nodded, eyes still fixed on the screen. She handled it like a sniper. In a college dorm in Tempe, a political science major named Malik Thomas opened his laptop and started a thread titled, "Why This Crockett Moment Matters More Than You Think." By the next morning, it had over 90,000 shares. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, journalists hovered outside the chamber waiting for the hearing to adjourn. Everyone was trying to position themselves near Crockett, but her team had already locked things down. She wouldn't be giving a statement yet. Not today. She walked out quietly, flanked by her aides, avoiding eye contact with the cameras. Someone tried to shout a question, but she didn't stop. Her body language said it all. She wasn't looking to go viral. She was doing her job. Later that evening, her communications director, Kiara Owens, opened her phone and nearly dropped it. Over 2 million views in under 4 hours. Hashtags trending. Celebrities quoting her line. Civil rights leaders calling for interviews. She turned to Crockett, who was quietly finishing up a folder of documents at her desk. You know they're calling this the line of the decade, right? Kiara asked. Crockett didn't look up. They can call it what they want. I call it Tuesday. But while Crockett was staying focused, the rest of the country was just starting to react, and the conversation was about to explode. Before she was Congresswoman Crockett, before the cameras, before the name started trending every 6 hours, she was just Jasmine, raised in St. Louis, Missouri. Her mother worked nights at a health clinic. Her father was a school bus driver who never missed a day behind the wheel. Jasmine grew up in a house where you didn't speak unless you had something worth saying. And when you did, you better say it like you meant it. She wasn't the loudest in school, but she always had this way of making teachers pause. Her classmates joked that Jasmine didn't argue. She cross-examined. At 16, she was already volunteering at municipal court proceedings just to sit and listen. Not for credit, not even for school. She just liked the way truth sounded when it had no place to hide. Her path to politics started in a courtroom in Texarkana, Texas. Fresh out of law school, she took on a case no one else wanted. A young man, wrongfully arrested, held for 3 days, no charges. He didn't have money for a lawyer. The city just wanted it gone. But Crockett didn't take the easy route. She stayed up for 2 nights pulling records, finding contradictions in officer reports, interviewing witnesses that had been ignored. When she walked into that courtroom and laid it all out, the judge stopped her midway through opening statements and said, "Ms. Crockett, you sure you're fresh out of school?" She smiled. "Only on paper." She won the case in less than an hour. Word got around. That's how she moved. Quiet wins with loud meaning. Over the next 5 years, she became the person families called when everything else had failed. Police misconduct, land disputes, eviction battles. She took cases for free when she had to and made her living off the ones she could bill. By the time she ran for state legislature, she wasn't just known. She was trusted. She didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who had sat at the kitchen tables of people who don't have lobbyists. That mattered. When she won her seat in the Texas House, they told her to keep her head down, learn the game, play it safe. She did the opposite. In her first year, she authored a bill pushing back on aggressive policing tactics during protests. It didn't pass, but the hearings drew national attention. That was the first time C-SPAN viewers saw her in action, voice calm, hair pulled back, surrounded by men twice her age who couldn't get her to back down. Back in Washington, some party leaders started watching her clips on mute, just to study her body language. She didn't blink much, didn't fidget, never smiled unless she meant it. When she eventually ran for Congress, it wasn't about ambition, it was about scale. She wanted a bigger table because she was tired of trying to shout from the hallway, and when she won her seat, she sent her mother a note. It read, "You told me to make my voice matter. I found a bigger mic." So when Trump told her to sit down, girl, in front of the world, she wasn't shocked. She'd heard worse, from judges, from police chiefs, from wealthy developers who thought she was the assistant. But she also knew something else. Millions of people were watching now, girls who looked like her, women who had been dismissed with the same kind of lazy disrespect for decades. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to throw her papers or storm out. She just needed to do what she always did, cut to the truth and let it stand on its own. And that's why the clip hit so hard. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a culmination. A story that began in courtrooms, city halls, and long nights, staring at spreadsheets, trying to keep someone from losing their home. Now, all that history had met a platform too big to ignore, but the cameras only caught the exchange. What they missed was what happened behind closed doors once the hearing ended. The hearing adjourned just after 5:30 p.m., but the real noise started as soon as the cameras stopped rolling. Inside the committee room, aides scrambled to pack up files, while reporters tried to snag off-the-record comments from members slipping towards side exits. Security escorted Trump out a separate door, shielded from the growing crowd of journalists now planted just outside the Capitol steps. Behind the dais, Jasmine Crockett quietly gathered her papers, not rushing, not dragging her feet either. A junior staffer handed her a bottle of water without saying a word. She took it, nodded slightly, and moved toward the hallway. She hadn't said anything about the moment yet, not to anyone. But everyone around her was talking. Down the corridor, Representative Elaine Brewster leaned against a marble column, whispering into her phone. "Yes, I heard it live." No, she didn't flinch. Yes, he really said that. In the press room, 2 floors down, it was chaos. Dozens of journalists fought for quotes, tweets flying every few seconds. "Need confirmation," Trump said, "girl," on the record. "Has Crockett made any statement yet?" "Find out if she's doing MSNBC tonight." Meanwhile, inside a private office just off the floor, Trump was livid. "That woman, she was disrespectful," he snapped to one of his advisors. "I was answering the damn question." The advisor didn't respond. He just stood there watching the team of PR strategists huddled by the window, debating whether to release a statement or let it die down. "Should we spin it as banter?" someone asked. "No," another said. The tone was off. She came across sharp, serious. "You try to make it a joke, you'll look worse." One aide muttered, "We should have seen it coming. She's got a courtroom mouth." Trump heard that part. What?" "Meaning she doesn't fall for bait," the aide said. "She waits for you to hang yourself." Back in Crockett's office, her chief of staff, Kiara, paced the floor with a phone glued to her ear. Every few seconds, it buzzed with another incoming call. CNN, MSNBC, The Root, BBC, even a French outlet wanted comment. But Jasmine was still silent, still seated, still sipping her water. "I need to talk to her," Kiara said into the phone. "No, I don't know if she's going to make a statement. I don't think she's playing it that way." She looked over. "You okay?" Jasmine raised her eyes just for a second. "I'm fine. We didn't come here to feed a moment. We came here to ask questions." But even she knew it was bigger than that now. Outside the Capitol, protesters had already started gathering. Some held signs that read, "Respect Black women," while others wore shirts with her quote printed in bold lettering. That didn't take long. Someone had it on Etsy within hours. One reporter tried to ask her as she exited, "Congresswoman Crockett, do you feel disrespected?" She stopped walking, turned slowly toward the mic, and said, "I feel focused." That clip alone was enough to give every morning show a headline. Inside conservative circles, the spin had begun. Talk radio shows played the exchange on a loop, trying to argue that Trump's tone had been colloquial. Others tried to redirect attention. "What about her attitude?" one host barked. "What about her tone?" But the center wasn't holding. This wasn't about tone anymore. This was about pattern. In progressive circles, the response was sharp. "Black women don't get to have bad days," one commentator wrote. "They get told to sit down, no matter how qualified, how calm, how right they are." Meanwhile, Crockett's inbox filled with emails from strangers, some supportive, some not. One in particular stood out. It read, "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't back down. You didn't blink. My daughter just asked me what your name was. That means something. Thank you." She read it 3 times, but outside her office, the media storm was far from over, and Trump's team wasn't staying quiet for long. By nightfall, Trump's media machine was already humming. The clip had gone viral, yes, but that didn't mean they had to let the narrative settle, not without a fight. Inside a sleek office space in Arlington, a team of communication strategists gathered around a flat screen, playing the exchange for the 15th time. "She didn't yell," one aide pointed out. "She didn't get emotional. That's going to make it harder for us." "So we flip it," another responded. "Say he was being casual. Say she misunderstood him." An intern chimed in, unsure. "But it doesn't really sound casual." Everyone turned to him. Silence. Trump, watching from Mar-a-Lago via a private feed, leaned back in his chair. "They'll forget about it in a week," he muttered. "We just need something louder to push it out of the headlines." So the plan formed fast. Distract, discredit, double down. First came the tweets from political allies, statements of support for President Trump's candor. One senator posted, "What happened today wasn't offensive. It was political theater, and Rep. Crockett knows how to play the cameras." Another pundit tweeted, "This is what happens when we can't even talk to each other without someone crying racism." The next morning, Trump went on a conservative radio show in Palm Springs. The host asked him directly, "Do you regret what you said to Rep. Crockett yesterday?" Trump chuckled. "Regret? No, I was just trying to get through a long hearing. She was going on, and I said what I said. People are too sensitive." "But do you think the way you said it?" "I didn't say anything wrong," he cut in. "And you know what? A lot of people agree with me. They just don't want to say it out loud." He grinned like it was checkmate. But the damage wasn't going anywhere. At the same time, Crockett still hadn't responded beyond her short remark outside the Capitol. Her silence created more noise than any press release could have. People wanted her reaction, but she gave them her focus instead. That night, during a segment on CBS, political analyst Trevor Langford broke it down plainly. "This isn't about a phrase, it's about a habit," he said. "It's about a man who's been in power for decades and still speaks like power excuses everything." Back in Texas, local news stations ran features titled, "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" profiling her journey, her record, her courtroom wins. Viewers who had never heard her name before were suddenly paying attention. Meanwhile, her staff was working overtime. Every platform wanted her. The Today Show, CNN, NPR, even late-night shows were reaching out. But Crockett was selective. She didn't want a media tour. She wanted the hearing record to stand for itself. She told her team, "This is about what he said, but it's also about how I responded. That's what matters." Still, the online attacks got worse. Fake quotes, doctored images, old footage from completely unrelated events misrepresented as evidence of her being rude, loud, or angry. One video tried to compile every moment she'd interrupted a speaker in prior hearings, framing her as hostile. It racked up thousands of views in far-right circles, but the mainstream narrative wasn't moving. Because for every doctored clip, there were 5 more real ones showing her calm, her precision, her refusal to flinch when it mattered most. A young journalist named Maya Layton wrote a column in the Arizona Sun-Times that captured the mood perfectly. "We don't ask men to make themselves smaller to be heard. We ask women to smile while getting dismissed. Crockett didn't smile, she didn't yell, she corrected, and that correction cut louder than any shout could have. Meanwhile, Trump's defenders grew louder, but it was starting to sound like shouting over a crowd that had already turned its head. And deep down, even Trump knew this wasn't going away quietly. But while his team scrambled for distractions, the rest of the country had already started having a different conversation. One Crockett didn't have to lead because she'd already sparked it. By the third day, the story was everywhere. Morning shows framed it one way, late-night comics another. College professors were dissecting it in political ethics classes. Conservative hosts screamed about weaponized identity politics. Progressives called it long overdue accountability. And somewhere in between all the yelling, something else started to happen. People actually started listening. It wasn't about policy, not taxes or trade. It wasn't even about Trump anymore. It was about the moment, the sentence, and what it represented. In Birmingham, Alabama, a high school debate coach named Lorraine Reeves played the clip for her students, then paused the screen. "Tell me what you saw," she said. A girl in the front row raised her hand. He didn't expect her to answer like that. Another chimed in. "It's like, he thought he was talking to someone who wouldn't answer at all." The room nodded. Out in Des Moines, Iowa, a retired librarian named Tom Beck posted a message on Facebook that went quietly viral. It read, "I'm 76. I've seen my share of hearings, scandals, speeches. But this wasn't about left or right. This was about whether we let people with power keep speaking to others like they don't deserve to be in the room." The post was shared over 20,000 times. In Phoenix, a woman named Farah Densley, who'd never been involved in politics, uploaded a short video explaining why Crockett's response made her cry. Her voice cracked as she said, "My daughter's going to grow up in a world where she can hear that kind of sentence and know exactly what it means, and also know exactly how to respond." Even comedians joined the conversation, but not just with jokes. On the Hamilton show, stand-up comic Will Ortega said, "She didn't clap back. She didn't pop off. She told the truth." And that's what shook people the most. Truth, calmly delivered from a black woman they thought they could talk over. Still, the division was clear. Crockett's congressional inbox overflowed. Thousands of messages came pouring in. Many were supportive, some weren't. One message simply read, "You're everything wrong with this country. Sit down," just like he said. She didn't reply. She never did with those. But it weighed on her staff. Kiara, her communications director, scrolled through messages one night and quietly whispered, "It's always louder when they feel seen." "Yeah," Crockett said from across the room, "because silence protects them." By now, social media had adopted Crockett as both symbol and standard. Black women quoted her in Instagram captions. Young girls posted side-by-side images of her and other barrier-breaking women in politics. Twitter threads broke down the phrase, "Sit down, girl," like it was a case study in American power dynamics. But it wasn't just commentary anymore. Something shifted when a group of middle-aged women in Spokane, Washington, organized a letter-writing campaign to send Crockett handwritten notes of gratitude. Over 300 envelopes arrived by the end of the week. Then came the poll numbers. One independent survey showed a rare spike in public approval for Crockett among voters aged 40 to 60 across both parties. Even more surprising, nearly 40% of self-identified independents said her response made them more interested in hearing her views on policy. That's when you knew this wasn't just a trending topic. This was resonance. In private, Crockett still kept a tight circle. She didn't cry. She didn't vent. But she did talk to her father one night over the phone. He said, "You sounded like your mama in that hearing." She laughed. She would have thrown her shoe. "Nah," he said. She would have made him hand it back to her first. It was a rare moment of lightness in a week that had turned heavier than anyone expected. Because even as the country argued, dissected, defended, and posted, one truth remained unchanged. Crockett didn't ask for this moment. She just didn't run from it. But what no one expected was that one quiet response would spark something much louder just a few days later, a letter from someone she'd never met. 3 days after the hearing, the national conversation stopped being about just Jasmine Crockett and Donald Trump. It started expanding, stretching into the corners of American life that rarely make it onto cable news. People started talking, not just tweeting or reposting, but really talking about what it means to be heard when you're not the expected voice in the room, especially when that room holds power. In a university auditorium in Boulder, Colorado, Professor Shelby Gaines stood in front of a packed class, chalk in hand, replaying Crockett's response from the hearing. "This," she said, circling the word truth on the board, "is what composure sounds like when it stands next to power." One student raised his hand and asked, "Why did it go so viral? I mean, he's said worse." Professor Gaines nodded. "Because sometimes it's not the words, it's the setting. It's who they're said to, and who refuses to shrink when they are." Meanwhile, back in Dallas, Reverend Carl Winston preached a Sunday sermon without notes, walking the aisles of his small church, voice full of something raw. "They told her to sit down," he said, "but she sat in her truth. And that, church, that is resistance." A few miles away, at a black-owned coffee shop near South Lamar, regulars argued over lattes and headlines. "She played it perfect," one woman said, stirring her tea. "Didn't give them a soundbite, gave them a mirror." "But what if she had clapped back harder?" her friend asked. "Would it have landed stronger?" "No," a man at the counter said, turning around. "You know why it hit hard? 'Cause she knew she didn't need to be louder to be stronger." Not everyone agreed, of course. Some tried to bend the moment to fit their own narratives. On cable news, certain commentators framed it as an overreaction. One guest on a syndicated morning show even said, "Maybe it's just how he talks. Shouldn't we give him the benefit of the doubt?" That clip spread too, but with fierce rebuttal. Because while the debate raged on television, real stories started surfacing. Stories about women, especially black women, being dismissed in meetings, interrupted mid-sentence, called girl by men with less experience and more power. An assistant principal in El Paso posted a video saying she'd heard that phrase 5 times in her career. Never from a student, always from someone in a suit. A healthcare executive from Portland wrote an op-ed for a local paper. Her piece was titled, "I was told to calm down girl during a budget meeting. I was the CFO." These stories poured out like water behind a broken dam. Not sudden outrage, but long-held, quiet exhaustion, finally finding words. And through it all, Crockett didn't play the star. She declined interviews on the biggest national platforms. She refused to frame herself as a victim. Her only public comment came during a Q&A with a local journalist in Austin. "Do you think he was being intentionally disrespectful?" the reporter asked. Crockett paused, then said, "I think intent is less important than impact. And if someone doesn't understand the weight of their words, maybe they shouldn't be carrying them in public." That line hit just as hard as the one from the hearing. At a roundtable in Detroit, civil rights organizers began organizing Speak It workshops for young women of color. The first flyer read, "You don't have to yell to be powerful, just be clear." At a school board meeting in Tallahassee, a high school junior named Jaya read Crockett's quote out loud before making her case for a new student-led ethics committee. The room gave her a standing ovation. Somewhere in the background of all this, political analysts started whispering about 2028. Not because Crockett had mentioned it, but because something had shifted, and her name was at the center of it. Kiara, her communications director, joked about it one evening as they reviewed emails. "You realize people are putting your quote on coffee mugs now?" Crockett barely looked up. "I hope they're spelling it right." "You're not moved by any of this?" Crockett shrugged. "I'm moved by the fact that more people are listening, not to me, but to each other." But what neither of them expected was the message waiting in her inbox that night. A letter that wasn't from a journalist or a fan or a politician, but from someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be told to sit down and decided instead to stand. It was nearly midnight when Kiara saw it. Buried between dozens of interview requests and press summaries sat a simple email, subject line, "Thank you from Tulsa." There was no signature, no title, no Twitter handle, just a short message from someone named Clara Bishop. Kiara opened it, expecting another kind note. What she read made her stop cold. "Dear Representative Crockett, I watched what happened at the hearing. I've watched it 5 times now. I'm 68 years old. I've never written to a politician in my life. When he told you to sit down, I heard my high school principal in 1973 tell me, 'You're not the kind of girl who gives speeches.' When you looked up and answered him without yelling, without backing away, without pretending it didn't happen, I felt 17 again. I felt like I mattered. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every woman who was ever told to lower her voice when her truth made people uncomfortable. Thank you. With deep respect, Clara Bishop, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Kiara didn't forward it right away. She just sat with it. The next morning, she handed Crockett her phone. "Read this," she said softly. Crockett took the phone, read in silence, then placed it on the table without a word. "Do you want me to respond?" Kiara asked. Crockett thought for a second. "No, I want to meet her." 3 days later, Crockett's office arranged a visit. No cameras, no announcement. Just a quiet meeting in a public library in downtown Tulsa. When Clara walked in, wearing a simple tan coat and holding a worn notebook, Crockett stood and smiled. "I'm not here as a congresswoman today," she said. "Just Jasmine." Clara smiled back. "And I'm not 68 today. I'm 17. You gave me that." They talked for over an hour. No staff, no reporters. Clara told stories about growing up in segregated neighborhoods, about watching leaders rise and fall, about being passed over for promotions by men who'd trained under her. "I stopped raising my hand," she said. "Figured there wasn't much point." Crockett listened, leaned in, asked questions. At one point, Clara pulled out a folded newspaper clipping of Shirley Chisholm and said, "When I was little, this was the woman we thought would break it all open." Crockett nodded. "She did. She cracked it. Now we keep widening the gap." When the meeting ended, they hugged. Nothing formal, nothing posed. But Clara's granddaughter, who had driven her there, snapped a quick photo, just the two of them by the front window, laughing. She posted it later that day with a simple caption. "My grandma met her hero today. They didn't talk politics. They talked truth." The photo spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, it had been shared by Ava DuVernay, Tracy Ellis Ross, and even Sherilyn Ifill, each adding their own caption about legacy, lineage, and quiet courage. Clara Bishop, who'd never had a social media account, became a trending name overnight. When CNN picked up the story, the headline read, "The letter that said everything without a microphone." Requests flooded in to interview Clara. She declined them all. She only agreed to write one piece for the Tulsa Sentinel, her hometown paper. It was titled "The Day I Felt Heard," and in it, she described Crockett not as a politician, but as a mirror held up to a nation too used to looking away. Meanwhile, Crockett issued no press release about the visit. No campaign video, no photo op. When asked about it during an interview weeks later, she simply said, "Some moments belong to the people who lived them, not the people who watched." That quote became the banner headline on 3 political blogs the next morning. The whole exchange, one letter, one meeting, one photo, reminded people that real change doesn't always come from the biggest stages. Sometimes it starts with a quiet reply that lands in the inbox of someone who thought their voice had been lost. But while that story was settling into hearts across the country, another shift was happening. This time, inside the very institution where it all began. The House of Representatives doesn't move quickly. Not for outrage, not for media pressure, not even for its own reputation. But this time felt different. A week after the exchange, the Ethics Committee quietly convened an emergency session behind closed doors. No press, no statements. Just 12 members from both parties staring at the same screen, watching the same 47-second clip again. "Sit down, girl." Pause. Then Crockett's reply. Silence. Even those who usually rolled their eyes at optics admitted, this one couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just bad PR. It was a moment that made the entire chamber feel complicit. Some representatives wanted to let it pass. Others, especially those facing re-election, pushed for a statement of condemnation, not of Trump specifically, but of disrespectful language directed toward any member, regardless of gender or background. It wasn't much, but it was a crack. Meanwhile, on the floor of the House, whispers of procedural reform started circulating. Conversations about setting clearer boundaries for how witnesses address members. One proposal suggested new mandatory briefings for former presidents who testify, because apparently that's where we are now. And outside of politics, the shift was visible in quieter ways. Crockett was invited to speak at Stanford School of Government, then Harvard Law, then a surprise invitation from a small community college in Jackson, Mississippi. She accepted all three. At Stanford, she opened her remarks not with a story about the hearing, but with a story about her first landlord case as a public defender. These people weren't waiting for headlines, she said. They were waiting for someone to speak plainly, to listen clearly, to make room for truth in rooms that weren't built for them. At Harvard, she spoke about tone, the ways women of color are told their volume is too loud even when they whisper, their questions too aggressive even when they're fair. And in Jackson, she broke from her notes entirely and asked the room, "What do you do when someone tells you to sit down? Politely, cruelly, or quietly?" A student in the front row said, "You stand anyway." Crockett smiled. "Exactly, even if your knees shake." Back in D.C., younger representatives began echoing her language in their own committee sessions. It wasn't mimicry, it was something else. Permission, a shift in posture. Suddenly, being direct didn't seem so abrasive. Being clear didn't seem so risky. Crockett herself remained focused. She introduced 2 new pieces of legislation in the weeks that followed, one on data transparency in federal contracts, another on public protections during emergency detentions. Neither had anything to do with the hearing, but both were built from the same core belief: truth works best in daylight. Yet behind the scenes, Trump was still fuming. He complained during a fundraiser in Pensacola that the hearing was a setup, that the clip had been twisted, that Crockett had an attitude. One donor asked him if he regretted saying it. He laughed and changed the subject. The world kept moving. Crockett's staff kept grinding. They barely had time to catch up on the mail, let alone the dozens of invitations pouring in. But they noticed something. The tone of the messages had shifted. It wasn't just about praise or politics. It was about reflection. One came from a woman in Santa Fe. "I've worked in finance for 20 years. I've been called girl more times than I can count. I never said anything, but after watching you, I went into my boss's office and told him to use my name. Just my name, that's all. It felt like a win." Another came from a teenage boy in Oregon. "I saw your video and showed it to my mom. She cried. I didn't get why at first, but then she told me stories about how people spoke to her at her old job. Now I get it. Thank you." Crockett read every one of them. She didn't save the headlines. She saved the letters. But while policies were debated and stories were shared, one final question lingered quietly in the background. What does respect look like when the cameras are off and no one is trending anymore? The clip faded from trending lists eventually. New headlines took over, new outrages, new distractions. But for many people, the moment never really went away. It stayed lodged in memory, not because of the drama, but because of what it revealed and what it asked of us. In the months that followed, Representative Jasmine Crockett never once used the phrase viral moment to describe what happened. She never called it historic, never leaned into the fame, never gave the media what it wanted, a polished narrative with a clean arc and a big, glossy ending. Because Crockett knew better than most, real change doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in conversations, in small rooms, in the quiet decisions people make about how they show up. She kept working. She showed up to hearings. She kept her questions sharp. She wrote legislation that most people will never read, but that will affect real lives. She met with constituents in strip malls and church basements and high school auditoriums, answering questions about housing, healthcare, and transit, like none of the viral stuff had ever happened. And that's what made people respect her more. Not the clapback, not the attention, but the steadiness. She didn't turn the moment into a brand. She let it become a reference point, a proof of what it looks like to hold your ground without turning your voice into a weapon. That's what stuck with people. A teacher in Flagstaff said it best during a parent-teacher forum. "My daughter watched that video. She didn't see a woman being disrespected. She saw a woman respond like she knew who she was. That matters." In an age of overreaction, Crockett's calm became radical. Because here's the truth. There are still too many rooms in this country where respect is unevenly distributed. Too many tables where certain people are expected to stay quiet. Too many conversations where power expects obedience, not honesty. But moments like this don't just expose the cracks. They also show us who's ready to push back without flinching. Crockett didn't win a battle that day. She didn't destroy anyone or shut down anything. What she did was remind us what strength actually looks like. It's not always volume. It's not always fire. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes it's the ability to let someone show their hand while you hold your ground. And sometimes it's just saying, "You don't get to talk to me like that." Simple, clear, undeniable. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. If you know who you are, you don't need to prove anything in the moment. You just need to be consistent. When someone tries to shrink you, don't match their energy. Hold yours. Because sooner or later, people will see the difference. They'll remember the way you carried yourself, the way you didn't flinch, the way you made it clear without being cruel. And that stays with them. So whether you're in a courtroom, a classroom, an office, or a hearing on live television, speak with purpose. Ask questions that matter. And when someone tries to diminish you with one sentence, answer with one that echoes longer, because that's how truth travels. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or something you've been through, or a time you stayed silent when you should have spoken up, don't let it stop here. Share the story, start the conversation, and subscribe for more content that goes deeper than the headlines. We're not here for the noise. We're here for what matters.